Okay, welcome back to our journey through topic for Unit 7, Global Conflict. And in topic 7.2, we're talking about the causes of the First World War. So when we get into this unit on global conflict, what we're focusing on is the time period from 1900 to 1945. And literally what we're focusing on is four crisis events and the impacts that they had on the world. So we have already read about and focused on the fall of land empires as a crisis and began to talk about the impacts. Secondly, we're getting into the First World War and how it changed the world. Later, we'll get into the World Depression and how it impacted the world. And finally, World War II. So ultimately, what we're answering in this unit is what developments and events define the postmodern age, and how did these impact the processes humans use to survive and prosper. So when we look at this lesson, what you're going to be learning today, I want you to focus on being able to explain the causes of the First World War. Not only identify and describe what those causes were, but explain how and why they led to the war as a development during this time period. So, the very first thing and what you're going to focus on during this is you're going to identify the four key things that led to the development of the war. And as you go through them, you are going to focus on explaining how and why they led to the war. So, just to introduce ourselves to World War One. World War One was a shock. And even to this day, historians argue about what it actually was. Some people characterize it as a family feud, being another in a long line of wars between European states. Others go a little bit darker and say this was the war to end all wars, that the things that we saw happen during this war were never seen in history in the past and were never supposed to be seen again. And then finally, other peoples characterize this as the war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, we know that this did shock the world, and it is actually going to be a big contributing factor for World War II. But historians kind of go back and really kind of look at this and said, where did this war come from? A lot of people point the blame at different people. Could it be the Austrians, the Russians, the Germans? Was it little Serbia's fault? Or was it England and France's fault for the world that they built? Ultimately, when this war began in 1914, peace, as it's shown in the background of this political cartoon, was dead. So this is Europe in 1914. We have Russia, the land empire. Now remember, Russia has not gone through its big fall as a land empire and its transition to communism yet. We have Germany, a brand new nation, an industrial power, but lacking in imperial possessions and struggling to maintain its position in the world. Their main rival was Great Britain, the world power. And then we also have France, who has recovered from its revolutionary period and is a player as well. We also have some aging and some weaker states. We have Austria-Hungary, which is the remnants of the old Holy Roman Empire. We have Italy, which though a new nation is developed, is still very weak. And then Spain and Portugal are still sticking around, but they don't enjoy the presence and the power that they once had. So when we talk about the main four causes of World War I, we characterize them by the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So as we go through this, I've provided you a graphic organizer that you're more than welcome to use, or you can take notes according to this. But as I go through this, remember our objective. We want to be able to identify, and we also want to be able to explain how they caused the war. So the first M stands for militarism. Militarism essentially is the aggressive military development and its preparedness. Starting in about 1850, all the strong nations in the world benefited from the Second Industrial Revolution through this massive military buildup. When we kind of go a little bit deeper, all the major powers believed that a strong and well equipped military would establish military superiority. And this was going to be the key for survival and prosperity. So when we look at it, starting in about 1850, as we see on this graph, Great Britain, represented by the United Kingdom, began to spend a lot of money. Then we see France's expenditures. Then we see the United States' expenditures and Germany. All the strong nations in the world were developing these very strong, technologically advanced militaries. So when we look at the overall leading up to the war, a major part of the budget was used to develop these armies and increase the closer that they got to war. Things like Maxim gun, heavy artillery, they were developed by the Second Industrial Revolution and used by very large and very well trained peacetime armies. These were used not as a means to protect, but a means of a threat to solve problems. Additionally, there began an arms race in navies. This began with the British Navy, whose well-equipped battleships, also known as dreadnoughts, were used to protect its empire. France, too, joined very soon afterwards, followed by Germany. There was a great rivalry on the ocean. So we see that leading up to this, starting in 1905, we see massive increases in the development of navies. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty did eventually lead to the end of this, but looking at the lead up to World War I between 1905 and 1915, even though I know the war started in 1914, look at all the massive advances. So this basically led to the idea that militaries were glorified. Why? Well, because military and this military development cost a lot of money. And so this idea of preparedness, this idea of having a very large and well-equipped army with the latest weapons was tied into the nationalism. Now, when issues broke out between nations, instead of negotiating and using diplomacy, these militaries and the threat of military action are going to be used as tools to solve problems. Every strong nation is going to have this large, well-equipped army that they're willing to use. So by the dawn of 1914, Europe had really turned into an armed camp. The next is alliances. Alliances are essentially agreements to provide mutual defense. They can be made publicly or they can be made in private. But essentially what happens is they're made when you kind of run out of money building your army. And so by making these mutual defense agreements through alliances, what you're actually doing is you're furthering the size of your army to be able to protect yourself. Now, these grew out of rivalries. By 1914, you have some pretty bitter rivalries between nations. Great Britain was a great rival with Germany, both trying to compete for world power. France and Great Britain, they actually were alliances because of the German threat. And Russia, well, Russia was a threat to the Balkan Peninsula, that's where Greece is, and the dying Ottoman Empire. So there's a lot of rivalries going on in which people are seeking alliances to be able to protect themselves. So when we look at a map, we have the two main alliances, the Triple Alliance, represented in green, and the Triple Entente, represented in pink. So when we look a little bit further, we essentially have the six strong nations in Europe divided into two armed camps. This would very easily lead to a war. And remember, each of these six nations had a very technologically advanced, well trained, and large empire that they were willing to use to solve problems. So when we kind of get a little bit deeper in alliances, our specific historical examples would be the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. But there were other agreements. Russia had made alliances with nations like Serbia, and overall was the protector of a group of people known as the Slavs who lived in Eastern Europe. They agreed to protect them from outsiders who would come to hurt them. England also had created a treaty where if poor little Belgium was attacked, they would come to their aid. Notice something here. We basically created a situation where a simple event would trigger the alliance system and drag all nations into a war. Next, we have imperialism. And we know what imperialism is. It's basically when a strong nation seeks to dominate a weak nation politically, economically, and culturally. And so this is going to lead to new and larger empires around the world. And what's driving this is nations had to have colonies to survive economically for markets, resources, investments, and other foodstuffs, but also to prosper, to be considered a strong nation. Remember that scoreboard. So when we look at the world in 1900, the world's pretty much been imperialized. But you still had to have that scoreboard growing. You still had to find new areas of markets, resources, investments, and foodstuffs. So the only thing left to do now that the world's been imperialized is to take colonies and possessions from other areas, which is exactly what they did, especially Germany. Being a new nation, Germany did not have the opportunity to create colonies in Germany and Asia. And what they had to do is they had to basically carve them out, take them over, which they did from the French in Morocco and the British in Eastern Europe, further intensifying the rivalries. Also, the Germans had wedged their way into China, not respecting the British power there. Obviously, what's happening is these states are competing for things to survive, divided into alliances, each with a very well-equipped and large military. Then this competition is going to lead to a growth in nationalism. Nationalism is defined as an intense loyalty to a group that share a common culture. And after 1815, this became very extreme. Now remember, this grows out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment said, and empiricism said, that it would make obviously logical sense for people of a similar background, culture, religion, language to rule themselves and to be independent of outside powers. So after 1850, this nationalism, which is going to become very extreme, develops into two main types. First, in strong nations, it replaced the idea of religion to unify the people. Using the brand new mass media, mostly books and newspapers, nations would send out propaganda, such as the propaganda you see to the right, arguing that their state was great and to make other nations look bad. In this, we see the Kaiser on the left, the leader of Germany, shaking hands with an elderly, old German gentleman, showing unity and showing the military power behind them. Also, in this British political cartoon, the brand new German Navy that was competing was made to look bad because the British Navy was better. There were books, plays, all sorts of stuff going on that was designed to make whatever nation it was produced in look good, but also develop the idea of a common enemy and create rivalries between these nations. So, nationalism, on one hand, was used to unify strong nations. But what about those nations that weren't nations yet? Nationalism developed to throw off an outside ruler. This was very big in an area called the Balkans, which essentially is where Greece is. Even as early as 1888, the great German statesman Otto von Bismarck, the prime minister and second in command in Germany, said that one day a great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. Well, in the Balkans, which was ruled by Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, we basically see the rise of a first nationalist movement. This was called the Black Hand, and the Black Hand symbol is the circle that you see on the left. The goal of the Black Hand was to achieve Slavic independence in the Balkans. Now, these leaders, as shown by this political cartoon, knew this was a hotbed, but they weren't ready to give these people their independence because it would cause great rivalries for power in the region. So, when we started this off, we wanted to be able to explain the causes of the First World War. We want to be able to identify them, and we want to be able to explain how and why they led to the war. So we use the acronym MAIN. Militarism is the development of a very technologically advanced and large army within a nation. The military power was glorified. All strong nations had a strong military. And by 1914, nations were willing to use these strong militaries to solve problems instead of diplomacy. Alliances, the agreement for mutual defense between nations, grew out of the various rivalries. You have the Germans and the British were the main one. And what it did is it divided Europe into two armed camps. On one side, you have the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Italy, and Austria, versus the Triple Entente, which means peace, made by Russia, Great Britain, and France. Europe is divided into two armed camps and essentially is now ready for war. Imperialism, the desire for colonies to meet their political and economic goals, threw gasoline on this competition because by 1890, 1900, there were no free spaces left. So the only way to increase your holdings was to take them from other people. Well, when you took them from other people, other strong nations, they weren't happy. They threatened to use their military, and all the people on their alliance were on their sides. To further make the situation worse, we have nationalism. That twisted nationalism where we believe our country is better and other areas are not as good as us. Now, this takes two courses. On one hand, the strong nations use us for unity, and with the application of propaganda within the mass media, people were literally brainwashed into believing that their nation was the best and right in all situations, and other nations were their sworn enemy and threats. It also took the form of freedom fighters. This did develop in India with the Indian National Congress. It did develop with Africa with Pan-Africanism. But one of the most dangerous areas was the Balkan Peninsula, Greece, where you have a nationalist organization called the Black Hand that is willing to do whatever they need to do to be able to be free. So by 1914, you have a very explosive situation ready to go off.